Saturday, October 27, 1962, Washington, D.C. The clocks inside the Pentagon read 10 a.m. The Joint Chiefs of Staff are not staring down a blinking opponent. They are staring at a logistical dead end. Intelligence reports confirm that Soviet technicians are operationalizing medium-range ballistic missiles capable of striking Washington. The window for diplomacy is mathematically closing. In the real timeline, President Kennedy ignores the recommendation to strike. In this analysis, we alter one variable. He accepts the math. He authorizes OPLAN 312. This is not a story of heroes. It is a story of payload capacities, fuel consumption, and the specific kill radius of the FKR-1 Meteor cruise missile. We are going to simulate the invasion of Cuba, not as a Hollywood drama, but as a systemic collapse. We must first dismantle the primary myth of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the idea of a clean victory. History records that Kennedy stared down Khrushchev. The data suggests they were two men locked in a dark room, fumbling with loaded weapons. The United States military was not bluffing. The machinery for invasion was already running. OPLAN 312 was not a vague concept. It was a finalized target list of 96 missile sites and airfields. OPLAN 316 was the invasion force, 100,000 troops, comprising the 82nd and 101st Airborne and the Marines. They were not waiting for orders. They were already staged in Florida and Vieques, physically loading ammunition. The fuse was not waiting to be lit. It was already burning. To understand the catastrophe that follows, we must audit the assets. In October 1962, the tactical air power assembled in Florida was unprecedented. Homestead Air Force Base and Key West were parking aircraft wingtip to wingtip. We are talking about 500 tactical fighters and bombers. The initial strike plan, OPLAN 312, called for 1,190 sorties in the first 24 hours alone. This is an air traffic control nightmare turned into a weapon. The objective was suppression of enemy air defences, or SEAD. The logic was linear: destroy the surface-to-air missile sites, the SA-2s, and then destroy the nuclear delivery systems. But linear logic fails in complex systems. The US Air Force was confident. They had reconnaissance photos. They knew where the SA-2 sites were. However, confidence is not data. The intelligence was incomplete. While U-2 flights had mapped the strategic missiles, the R-12s and R-14s, capable of hitting DC, they had missed the tactical reality on the ground. The Soviet order of battle included a weapon system that US planners were blind to: the FKR-1 Meteor. This was a ground-launched cruise missile with a range of 180 kilometres. It was not designed to hit cities. It was designed to hit ships. The intelligence gap is the pivotal variable in this simulation. The CIA believed the Soviet forces in Cuba were purely defensive or strategic. They did not know that Soviet commanders on the island possessed tactical nuclear warheads. Specifically, the FKR-1s were armed with 14 kiloton warheads. For context, that is roughly the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. These were not locked behind codes held in Moscow. Command and control protocols were fluid. General Issa Pliev, the Soviet commander in Cuba, had de facto authority to use tactical nuclear weapons if he faced an overwhelming invasion and lost contact with the Kremlin. We are about to provide him with exactly that scenario. Let us look at the physics of the US invasion plan, OPLAN 316. The plan called for an amphibious assault and an airborne drop. However, the logistics were strained. The US Navy did not have unlimited lift capacity. Reports from 1962 indicate that while they could transport the Marines, moving the heavy armor of the Army divisions would require a shuttle run, landing one wave, returning to Florida, and reloading. This creates a critical vulnerability, a pause. a period where light infantry is on the beach without heavy tank support, waiting for the ships to return. In a conventional war, this is a risk. In a nuclear environment, it is a death sentence. The timeline for the invasion was rigid. Once the president says go on OPLAN 312, the airstrikes, the clock starts ticking for OPLAN 316. You cannot bomb a country for weeks without invading. You lose the element of surprise and political capital. The Joint Chiefs estimated a gap of roughly 7 days between the first airstrike and the first boot on the ground. This 7-day gap is the most dangerous week in human history. It is the period where the Soviet forces in Cuba are being bombed, their communications are being cut, and they are deciding whether to use their nuclear assets before they lose them. General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the Air Force, argued that the Soviets would not respond. His assessment was based on the strategic imbalance. The US had thousands of nuclear weapons capable of hitting the USSR. The Soviets had very few ICBMs reliable enough to hit the US mainland. LeMay's math was focused on strategic deterrence. He failed to account for use-it-or-lose-it psychology at the tactical level. If a Soviet colonel sitting in a bunker near Mariel sees American F-100 Super Sabres destroying his radar and approaches his missile battery, he is not thinking about global deterrence. He is thinking about survival and his orders to defend the island. The airborne component adds another layer of fragility. The 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions were tasked with seizing airfields to allow for rapid reinforcement. This requires hundreds of C-130 Hercules transport planes flying in tight formation. In 1962, these aircraft had no countermeasures against heat-seeking missiles or advanced radar-guided flak. They were relying on the Air Force to completely sanitize the sky. If OPLAN 312 failed to destroy every single anti-aircraft gun and SAM site in the first 24 hours, the airborne drop would fly into a meat grinder. The US plan assumed 90% suppression. Historical data from Vietnam, just a few years later, suggests 90% suppression in jungle terrain is a statistical fantasy. Beneath the surface, the variable of uncertainty increases. 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines were operating near the blockade line. Each carried a nuclear torpedo with a 15-kiloton yield. The captains of these submarines were under immense pressure, suffering from heat exhaustion and carbon dioxide buildup due to failing life support systems. They were being hunted by US destroyers, dropping practice depth charges. In our scenario, once OPLAN 312 begins, those depth charges are no longer practice. They are live, high explosives. The threshold for a submarine captain to believe World War III has already started drops to 0. The decision is made. It is the morning of October 29, 1962. In this timeline, the U-2 shootdown over Cuba on the 27th was the final straw. Kennedy, exhausted and pressured by the unanimous advice of the ExComm and the Joint Chiefs, issues the order. Execute OPLAN 312. The diplomatic cables are cut. The Strategic Air Command moves from DEFCON 2 to a posture of immediate launch readiness. The systemic inertia takes over. Once the order leaves the White House, it enters the machinery of the Pentagon, where it is translated into codes, coordinates, and throttle settings. There is no turning back. We are now leaving the historical record. From this point forward, every event is a projection based on the known capabilities, fuel supplies, doctrine, and physics of 1962. We will break the simulation down into 4 distinct phases. Phase A, the air war. Phase B, the invasion. Phase C, the nuclear threshold. Phase D, the collapse. The math says this war does not end in a treaty. It ends in silence. Phase A begins at 0600 hours, October 30. The first wave of OPLAN 312 is not a surgical strike, it is a blunt instrument. 200 aircraft launch from Florida, supported by carrier-based aircraft from the USS Enterprise and USS Independence. Their targets are the SA-2 SAM sites surrounding Mariel and Havana. The airspace over Cuba becomes the most congested combat zone in history. The US Air Force achieves tactical surprise, but the physics of radar limit their success. Low-level ingress protects the fighters from long-range detection, but brings them into the engagement envelope of conventional anti-aircraft artillery. The sky lights up. By 0800 hours, the first casualty reports reach the Pentagon. They are higher than projected. The Soviet air defense network is denser than anticipated. While US pilots successfully destroy the primary radar installations, the optical tracking systems of the anti-aircraft guns remain functional. We see the loss of 12 aircraft in the first 2 hours. This attrition rate is sustainable for the US Air Force, but it has a secondary effect. It forces the remaining aircraft to fly higher, degrading their bombing accuracy. The surgical destruction of the missile sites is becoming a carpet bombing campaign. On the ground, the Soviet command structure is fracturing. General Pliev watches his air defense network disintegrate. Communications with Moscow are intermittent due to electronic jamming. He receives reports that US aircraft are not just targeting SAM sites, but are also striking the IL-28 bomber airfields. Pliev knows the doctrine. The Americans are blinding him before they invade. He looks at his assets. The strategic R-12 missiles are not ready. But the tactical FKR-1 cruise missiles are moved from their storage bunkers into firing positions. They are camouflaged in the palm groves overlooking the potential landing beaches. The US pilots flying overhead at Mach 0.9 do not see them. Simultaneously, the US naval base at Guantanamo Bay comes under artillery fire. Soviet and Cuban forces entrenched in the surrounding hills begin a pre-planned bombardment. The US Marines at the base are dug in, but they are outnumbered and outgunned by heavy artillery. OPLAN 312 includes air support for Guantanamo, but the majority of sorties are diverted to the north to suppress the missile sites. The base commander radios that he is taking heavy casualties. This creates a political pressure point in Washington. The president is told that American soil is under effective attack. The rules of engagement loosen further. Napalm is authorized. By hour 6, the fog of war is a literal cloud of smoke over western Cuba. The US Air Force has flown 600 sorties. They have damaged 60% of the known SAM sites. However, the key word is known. Mobile launchers have relocated. The Soviet tactical nuclear weapons remain 100% operational. The US pilots return to base, refueling and rearming for Wave 2. The logistical strain on the Florida bases is immediate. Fuel pumps are running hot. Maintenance crews are skipping safety checks to turn aircraft around. The systemic friction is building. The machine is running at 110% capacity, and it is beginning to vibrate. In Moscow, the reaction is not immediate retaliation, but confusion. The Soviet early warning system detects the massive air activity, but because no ICBMs have been launched, the strategic rocket forces hold their fire. Khrushchev is furious, but paralyzed. He cannot defend Cuba with conventional forces. The logistical distance is too great. He has two choices: launch a nuclear strike on the US mainland, suicide, or trust his commanders in Cuba to inflict enough pain to stop the invasion. He sends a cable to Pliev. Defend the island, do not allow capture of the strategic weapons. He does not explicitly forbid the use of tactical nuclear weapons. The silence is authorization. At sea, the US Second Fleet moves into the invasion staging areas. We are talking about dozens of transport ships, destroyers, and carriers converging on a patch of ocean north of Havana. They are following World War II protocols. tight formations for anti-submarine defense. This formation is optimal for defending against conventional torpedoes. It is largely suicidal against nuclear weaponry. The US Navy commanders are operating under the assumption that the enemy has no nuclear capability at sea. They are wrong. The Soviet B-59 submarine is maneuvering silently beneath the thermocline, tracking the noise of the propeller screws. Phase A concludes with the sun setting on October 30th. The air campaign has been a tactical success, but a strategic failure. The Cuban Air Force is grounded, the SAM network is degraded, but the invasion force, the Army and Marines, are still on their ships, and the Soviet nuclear teeth are still sharp. The US planners look at the bomb damage assessments and give the green light for OPLAN 316. They believe they have paved the road. In reality, they have simply rung the dinner bell. The invasion begins at dawn. Phase B, the invasion. Dawn, November 1st. The 82nd Airborne Division drops south of Havana to seize the airfields. Simultaneously, the Marines approach the beaches at Tarara. The logistical scale is massive, hundreds of landing craft hitting the surf. The resistance is fierce but conventional. Soviet motorized rifle regiments engage with T-55 tanks. The US Marines, supported by naval gunfire and close air support, establish a beachhead. They push inland. Casualties are heavy, in the thousands, but within acceptable planning limits. To the Pentagon, this looks like D-Day. They are winning. But at 0900 hours, the logic shifts. A Soviet tactical commander, commanding a regiment of FKR-1 cruise missiles hidden in the limestone hills, sees the horizon filled with US ships. He sees the Marines breaching the Soviet defensive lines. He has lost contact with Havana. His orders are to prevent the capture of his sector. He interprets the massive amphibious landing as an existential threat to the Soviet presence. He does not need a code from Moscow. He has the authority of pre-delegation in the event of invasion. He orders 2 FKR-1 launchers to target the beachhead and the offshore concentration of transport ships. The FKR-1 Meteor accelerates to subsonic speed. It flies low, hugging the terrain, invisible to the shipborne radar until the final seconds. The US Navy air defense systems of 1962 are designed to shoot down high-flying bombers, not sea-skimming cruise missiles. There is no Phalanx Sea-Whiz. There is no Aegis system. The first warning the sailors get is a visual sighting of a streak coming from the hills. The time from visual detection to impact is less than 15 seconds. There is no time to sound the general alarm. Detonation. The first 14-kiloton warhead airbursts at 400 meters above the beachhead. This is not just an explosion, it is a radiological event. The thermal pulse instantly vaporizes exposed personnel and ignites the fuel tanks of vehicles and landing craft within a 1.5-mile radius. The overpressure wave flattens the temporary structures and crushes the hulls of the smaller vessels. A second missile strikes the transport fleet offshore. Water is incompressible. The shockwave through the hull of a troop transport kills everyone below the waterline instantly, before the ship even breaks apart. In 1 second, the casualty count jumps from 2,000 to 25,000. The immediate aftermath on the beach is total systemic failure. The electromagnetic pulse, EMP, from the blasts fries the radios of the surviving units. The chain of command is severed. The invasion force is effectively decapitated. The landing craft that are still afloat turn back, but they are sailing into a radioactive cloud. The US Navy doctrine for this scenario exists, but it has never been tested. The ships disperse, breaking the anti-submarine formation, leaving them vulnerable to the conventional Soviet submarines. Chaos reigns. The invasion of Cuba has just ceased to be a military operation and has become a rescue mission in a hazmat zone. Washington receives the flash message. Nuclear detonation confirmed. Mushroom cloud over Tarara. The room goes cold. This is the moment where the simulation usually jumps to global Armageddon. But let's apply the logic of the time. The US leadership does not know who ordered the launch. Was it Khrushchev? Was it a rogue commander? Kennedy is faced with the choice: launch the ICBMs and end the world, or respond in kind locally. The doctrine of flexible response suggests a proportional retaliation. The US military demands permission to use tactical nuclear weapons against Soviet targets in Cuba. Kennedy, horrified by the reports of burning ships, grants it. Within 4 hours of the Soviet strike, US aircraft drop 2 low-yield nuclear weapons on the known Soviet command bunkers and the submarine base at Mariel. The physics of the exchange are symmetrical. The Soviet command structure in Cuba is vaporized. The tactical nuclear exchange is contained to the island, for now. But the atmospheric fallout is drifting towards Florida. In Miami, civil defense sirens begin to wail. The population, seeing the flashes on the horizon or hearing the news, begins a panic migration north. The Interstate 95 corridor becomes a parking lot. The US economy begins to seize up. This is the Phase B cliffhanger. We have had a tactical nuclear exchange. Roughly 40,000 soldiers and sailors are dead or dying. 2 cities in Cuba are burning. But the ICBMs are still in their silos. Why? Because both Kennedy and Khrushchev are staring into the abyss. The hotline, which was not yet a direct teletype but a slow cable system, is clogged with messages. They are both frantically signalling, "This was not my order." They are trying to put the genie back in the bottle. But the systems are on autopilot. The US Army divisions in Florida are refusing to board ships. The Soviet strategic rocket forces are requesting permission to preempt the inevitable American strike. Phase C, the pause. It is 1 week later. The sun rises over a Caribbean that is quiet. The invasion is cancelled. The US Navy has pulled back to a 200-mile perimeter. The radiation levels on the Cuban north coast are lethal. There are no more airstrikes. The war has entered a bizarre stasis. The world is holding its breath. Diplomatic channels reopen, but the tone is different. It is not negotiation, it is trauma management. The US public is in shock. The images of the burning fleet have traumatized a generation. The call for total war is loud from the hardliners, but the reality of the nuclear horror has sobered the executioners. The geopolitical shockwaves hit Europe. NATO goes to maximum alert. In response to the US nuclear use in Cuba, the Soviet Union tightens its grip on Berlin. They do not invade, they are too afraid of sparking the general war, but they close the access corridors. The world fragments into armed camps. The global economy enters a freefall. Stock markets in London, Tokyo and New York are closed indefinitely. The supply chains for oil and grain are disrupted as merchant shipping refuses to enter the Atlantic. The cost of insurance for a cargo ship goes to infinity. Global trade stops. In Florida, the logistical reality is grim. The hospitals are overwhelmed with radiation casualties evacuated from the fleet. We see the limits of 1960s medicine. There are not enough blood transfusions or antibiotics to treat the burns and radiation sickness. The death toll continues to climb days after the event. This creates a domestic political crisis. The US government is forced to declare martial law in the southeast to manage the refugees and the medical supplies. The American way of life is suspended. The focus shifts from conquering Cuba to surviving the aftermath. On the island of Cuba, the situation is apocalyptic. The government has effectively collapsed. The Soviet troops are isolated, hated by the local population who blame them for the nuclear fire and suffering from radiation sickness themselves. The US blockade is absolute. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out. Famine begins to set in within weeks. The Pearl of the Antilles becomes a quarantined wasteland. The Soviet Union cannot resupply them. They are written off as casualties of the Caribbean incident. By day 14, a ceasefire is technically agreed upon. The Soviets agree to remove the remaining missiles, what's left of them, under UN supervision. The US agrees not to invade, a promise that is easy to keep because the US military has no desire to land in a radioactive zone. It is a peace of exhaustion. There is no victory parade. Kennedy and Khrushchev both survive politically only because the alternative is chaos, but they are broken men. The Cold War does not end. It freezes into absolute zero. Phase D, the long winter. It is 1 month later. The radioactive fallout has largely dispersed, but the economic fallout is just beginning. The destruction of a significant portion of the US Navy's amphibious capability changes the global balance of power. The US can no longer project power as easily. The Pax Americana is dented. In the USSR, the humiliation of the Cuban disaster, the loss of their forces and the failure to protect their ally, triggers a hardline coup earlier than in our timeline. Khrushchev is ousted not in 1964, but in late 1962. A more militant, paranoid leadership takes over, convinced that nuclear war is inevitable. The arms race accelerates. In our timeline, the Cuban Missile Crisis led to the Test Ban Treaty and a hotline. In this timeline, it leads to a sprint for supremacy. Both sides conclude that limited nuclear war is possible and survivable. Doctrine shifts. The US invests heavily in tactical nuclear defences. The Soviets build thousands more missiles. The 1960s are not the era of the Beatles and civil rights progress. They are a grim decade of bunker building and proxy wars fought with extreme brutality. The cultural optimism of the mid-century dies on the beaches of Tarara. The broken-backed war theory becomes reality. The global economy remains depressed for a decade. International travel becomes rare. The internet, developed as ARPANET for resilient communication, is accelerated, but it remains a strictly military tool, never opening to the public. We live in a world of high walls. The Vietnam War never happens. The US has no appetite for foreign adventures after the Caribbean slaughter. However, the Soviet Union, emboldened by the damage they inflicted on the US Navy, pushes harder in the Middle East. The oil crisis of 1973 happens in 1965. The systemic instability is permanent. Act 3. 10 years later, 1972. The world is poorer, colder, and more armed. The US has recovered, but it is a fortress state. The draft is permanent. Civil liberties are curtailed in the name of nuclear readiness. Cuba remains a pariah state, a radioactive buffer zone that no one touches. The lesson learned was not nuclear war is unwinnable. The lesson learned was strike first, strike hard. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction, MAD, is replaced by mutually assured damage. The psychological scar on the American psyche replaces the optimism of the space age with a survivalist grit. This brings us to the present. Why simulate this? Because the variables of 1962 are the variables of today. Replace Cuba with Taiwan. Replace FKR-1 with DF-21 carrier-killer missiles. The logic of an amphibious invasion against a nuclear-armed adversary remains mathematically terrible. The assumption that a limited war will stay limited is the same gamble. In 1962, we survived because of luck and a refusal to follow the OPLAN to its conclusion. If Kennedy had followed the manual, if he had trusted the clean invasion plan, the script we just read would be our history book. We often view history as a series of inevitable events. It is not. It is a series of near misses in a chaotic system. The launch of OPLAN 312 did not happen, but the machinery for it was built, fueled, and aimed. The 100,000 casualties were not a fantasy. They were a probability distribution waiting for a dice roll. Today, the systems are faster, the missiles are more precise, and the reaction times are shorter. The math has not become safer, it has just become faster. Understanding the logistics of the past is the only way to recognise the trap of the future. Subscribe to the channel. We have more plans to declassify. Class dismissed. You survived the simulation. Now survive the reality. Equip yourself at the official supply depot. Because if the world is going to end, you might as well look prepared.